Buenos dias, amigos. Sue and I have had the wonderful pleasure of being in your country on 3 different occasions. We were there first in 1998, followed a second visit in 2005, and the third one, 2010, which was the year of the first conference in Rosario. And I'll talk a bit. I'll never forget the trip to Rosario in 2010. We took a bus, a large bus, that was proverbially late. I remember that very well. But in that bus was a wonderful group of people. And I was so impressed with the dedication and the commitment and the hard work and the struggles of the parents who arranged to get their child or their teenager or their adult with a disability to Rosario, the tremendous amount of excitement that they felt towards that conference, the wonderful treats that Andrea and Diego gave us along that way, and the wonderful conversations that I had with parents, with self-advocates, with professionals such as Andrea and Diego. And it really set the stage, not just for the conference, but it set the stage in my own thinking about the significance of the conference that we attended and how critical this partnership that had emerged was going to become in your future. The partnership among parents, professionals, and self-advocates, and researchers, and policymakers, and how the agenda that was discussed at Rosario, I remember the self-advocates developed a declaration at that conference, and how important the seeds that were planted at the Rosario conference would soon grow and develop and blossom and produce. And I think what's happened as a result of those 24 years is that you have made tremendous changes, despite the frustrations and the challenges that everyone is experiencing in this day and age. You've made tremendous progress towards a true person-centered approach to services and supports. And that's the challenge, because historically, that has not been the approach that we have used to people with intellectual disabilities. We've segregated them. We've de-emphasized their importance. We've treated them as incapable as opposed to capable. And the net result is we developed a system based upon a previous concept. And that concept I'll refer to in this presentation as a paradigm. People are making the shift to various degrees, some more than others, but nevertheless, that shift is occurring. Third, and this is a very fascinating question we ask, what are the major catalysts in your country that are prompting the paradigm shift to the shared citizenship paradigm? And here, public laws, covenants, treaty conventions were a major influence reported by 47% of the respondents. Considerable by 33%. So public laws and covenants are really important. And those are certainly a part of your efforts to make some changes. But what about parents and self-advocates movement? Major influence, 33%. Considerable influence, 47%. So parents and self-advocates have also been a major contributor. How about legal advocacy and litigation? Not much. In the US, yes. In a couple of European countries, yes. But by and large, and generally, we ask them for some primary factors in your estimation that are preventing the paradigm's acceptance. And the answers that we got internationally were quite consistent with the factors that you addressed in your survey. So, as now internationally, we have a universal language. Because if we're all speaking the same language, and if we're all moving down the same track, then we should see some significant change in reference to those key components. So they are being used for individual supports thus far, is that researchers and program providers are really developing a system of support description, so that when you go through and say, well, we're going to support the person in this way, you can be very, because if you say we will support the person, that means different things to different people. So you want to be specific here. And the degree of evidence-based inquiry and practice is determined by the degree of specificity by which you can describe what you do and measure its effect. And then finally, the paradigm vision. I can't overestimate the importance of conducting person-centered outcome evaluation. Because if you don't evaluate the outcome, then you have no idea about where the person was or where you are or where you're going. But then you use that information to improve the program. And I noticed again in the survey results, you've identified some outcomes already that you're looking at. Specifically, you're looking at some quality of life outcomes, some rights outcomes, some self-determination outcomes. You're looking at the status of personal goals. You're looking at the medical routines, which is not really an outcome, by the way. That's really more of a process. And then you're looking at medication. And again, that's really a process evaluation versus an outcome evaluation.
That our model of self-determination includes as a factor context. And our model of PCP, person-centered planning, also takes a long time to analyze the context, the resources, the services available, and make the person aware of that context, his own history, his own cultural legacy. So would you expand about the contextual model of human functioning? Would you explain us?
Yeah, of context. And in the AIDD manuals, we had context as a human functioning dimension, but it was never defined other than this general global idea of person environmental. So what we have done has been to do some serious thinking about what is the context within which we all live. And we've developed one, it's multi-level. And what we mean by that is our context is not just the microsystem, but it's also the mesosystem, meaning organizations and communities, and then the macro system, which is the larger societal level. And that each of those contexts have certain factors that are going to determine what happens to a person. And that we can't overlook the fact that I've gotten the feeling that the mesosystem, the organizational system, has kind of taken control of the context. And that makes sense in the sense that they're providing the services potentially. But in the process of doing that, you're, as I think you describe in one of your memos to me, you become an organizational controlled service delivery system. And so that's why you've correctly asked Miguel to talk about how can organizations really transform and change to accommodate the shared citizenship paradigm. And that shared citizenship paradigm focuses upon macro system. So that's one part of our multidimensional model of context. Secondly, it's multifactorial. And what we mean by that is that there are potentially a number of factors that influence our behavior. Now, some of those factors we can recognize, but not really change. For example, our age, our language, our culture, our ethnicity, the family structure. Those are really important factors, but we don't necessarily want to change them. In many cases, we can't change them, all right? But then there are some factors in this contextual model that we can change. Policies, practices, attitudes, strategies. And so the focus of your conference is on strategies for change in Latin America. It's at that micro, but then there's a third level, and it's a little more complex, but it's the third component of the contextual model is interactive. And knowing you two, I know you love that concept of interactions, okay, right? And what that means is that different levels interact with different factors. So that you have, for example, and this is where inclusive environments come into play, because inclusive environments are an excellent example of how factors at the macro system or mesosystem level interact with factors at the individual level to produce outcomes. Think about supported living. Think about supported employment. Think about inclusive education. Those are all mechanisms to build on the interactive nature of culture, or I'm sorry, of context, to produce desired results. So,
would you share with us some implementations in your country or some states of your country or other countries? Which?
Well, let's separate out in terms of person-centered strategies. Let's separate out person-centered planning from person-centered evaluation. Although they're closely related, but they are separate strategies. I think the best example of person-centered planning is reflected in how your individual support plan is developed and structured. And the most exciting examples of this that I've seen is to not talk about a personal or an individual program plan or an individual support plan, but it's my support plan. So just changing that title changes amazing things. For example, we did an analysis in the Netherlands, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, in which we analyzed the content of individual support plans. And what we found was that the majority of material in that individual support plan were really related to compliance by the organization. That we will provide A, B, C to the person, but nothing about how will we support the person. And therefore, if you, the bottom line was that the majority of material in an individual support plan has nothing to do with individual support. They have everything to do with how the organization is going to comply with rules and regulations. So it'd be interesting to do an analysis of your support plans and see if the result was the same. If you're really into person-centered planning, then it's a my support plan that's built around my support needs and my personal goals. And then related to each personal goal or support need, there is a specific support strategy. And then that support strategy leads to outcomes. And so then you indicate what are the desired outcomes, where if you've clearly identified personal goals, if you've clearly identified and specified the support strategy, then you can relate strategies to outcomes. And that gives you the framework for evidence-based practices. So, but it really talks about how important it is to align across. But also in that book, it provides some really nice examples. Then when it comes time to review that support plan, rather than looking at, has the organization complied with all these things, which is important, but it's not a support plan. It's a compliance plan. But then who do you ask to evaluate it? The client or the family, because they're evaluating my support plan, not some organization-based individual program plan. Now, I'm sure for those of you in the audience, that shakes you up a bit because that really is not how you have been taught to do support plans. So I think a key component of the new paradigm, or really good services, is that you think about my support plan. How do you involve the person in that? How do you provide information to the people who develop it with you as to what are the best strategies, and then what are the outcomes that I really want to evaluate? It's interesting to see the impact on the individual receiving the supports, because now they're looking at, have these supports really impacted my life at all? Centered evaluation is that you use some systematic approach to outcomes. I don't think you'll get very far, very honestly, with looking at personal goals as your only outcome measure. Because policymakers are going to ask you, well, so what's the impact? People are just happier? Policymakers want to know, is this person more independent, productive, community integrated? So to the degree that you can develop a systematic approach to outcome evaluation, you're going to be better off, from my experience. And you have a wealth of information available there. You're going to be hearing from Dr. Miguel Verdugo, who is probably the world's, if not the world's expert, one of the world's experts on quality of life outcome evaluation. And there's a wealth of information there that fills volumes. But we also, in the 12th edition of the AID manual, we also offer a couple of other options. You may want to look at what I call a holistic approach, where you look at and physicians might buy into a new system if it includes a strong medical component, or you may look at participation. There's a huge literature available on measuring the participation level of people. So again, the key idea of person-centered evaluation is that you use a system that's meaningful to the person, but I can't stress too much it being standardized so that you can go across people. Because unless you have that capacity, I don't think policymakers are going to be all that receptive to simply talking about subject-only changes. Even though to the subject, to the individual, they're very important. But from a systems political perspective, you need to have that standardized that can go across. And that's one of the things that I can refer, just one quick example.
That's
the most significant data sets in the United States is called the core indicators, the national core indicators. And, we have a state system, and about, I think it's 42 of the 50 states use the same outcome evaluation document. Or you have organizations like the Council on the accreditation of programs. They do a wonderful job on what they call their core quality indicators. And they've given out, they have data on 100,000 people on that. So, but again, it's the idea of systematizing so that you have accountability.
And do you evaluate the organization's performance through those core indicators of quality?
Yes, they develop it's core indicators looking at life domains and life areas like choice and responsibility and opportunities. I think they have 20 categories. And then actually sitting down and even asking the individual how they would evaluate themselves in terms of that, or using individuals, if the person is nonverbal, for example, using a verbal system, or someone who knows the individual well, who can answer as if they were the person. And then they can do all kinds of it. There's a gal by the name of Carrie Freeman, who works is a research coordinator for the for the Council on Quality Outcomes. And she's published extensively on what are some of the factors that influence these core quality outcomes. And that's the level that you eventually want to get to, so that you can talk a bit about cause and effect, as opposed to just process. You can form a large federation or institute for disability or something to that effect. The more that you can, for example, in Taiwan, years ago, they developed the Consortium on Community Living and their work. They now have 97 agencies involved in that. and they are involved in policy development, in service delivery, in fostering pilot programs like this group that you just mentioned. That's a wonderful idea. And it brings back a point that I'm having deja vu. We also analyzed individual service plans, support plans, in terms of a number of factors. And very simply, number one, how many pages does the average support plan contain? It's in the 40s. Question number two, what's the most common thing you do with that support plan? The answer was, we file it. Number three, how many people read it? The answer was like 2.5. And then the final question was, how many people understand it? And the most common response was no one. So here you spent all this time and money and energy developing this 45-page document that nobody understands, nobody reads it, it's filed, and then it's pulled out every 6 months and reviewed. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And by the way, in terms of my support plan, everybody has a copy of their support plan, and they carry it with them. And they ask people, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? It's a wonderful accountability,
In terms of that, when we were developing our model of person-centered planning, we reviewed the typical, the canonical ways of doing it, and it was centered in the person. You started building a group who thought and worked in favor of the person, but we saw that the person was not the main character there. So in our experience, it takes a little time. You don't just ask the person, what are your goals? Because maybe they never thought about that. And if they thought about that, they don't trust you will honor that. So it wouldn't work if we did it by the book of person-centered planning. So we made it differently, and it takes at least the first round a little while.
It's tough. It's tough because people have to move into a different role and function differently. And it's scary to think about how many individual support plans are developed without ever being there. And that's the reason why shared citizenship is such a key part of the new paradigm. And you can see just in this last 5 minutes of the discussion, you can see the ramifications of that, the implications. If it's a shared citizenship, then it's a my support plan. And we'll implement it together, we will evaluate it together, and we'll be a part of that partnership.
Should the activities of the person-centered plans be in the community?
Yes.
Preferable?
I think the focus always has to be the community. Realizing that some people are going to be in the community at different levels. They're going to function potentially differently in the community, but the focus is still the community.
There's still a gap between what policymakers want and their paradigms and what we are talking about. Because even if you have core values, well, they may just say, and so what's to me or what's to the community. So I recognize and we appreciate your advice to get that and not get stuck only with personal goals. But what is your experience in your country or others? How are policymakers getting sensitized to this is the right thing? We always remember that U.S. never signed the convention.
Yeah.
So there are any number of ways in which a government can say one thing and then act in another way. We are used to economical imbalances, but the same has happened in Netherlands or Canada. They were well advanced, and then a turn of the economic orientation turned the iceberg upside down. So what is your experience about that?
Well, a couple of things, Diego. One is, I think it's incorrect to think that all we need is more money, because realistically, more money is not going to be available, and that's true everywhere. Budgets are either maintained or they're reduced. So I think we have to begin with the premise that just spending more money on doing what we currently are doing is the way to go. And no policymaker, no funder is going to say, well, and I've sat in on hearings in which a service provider says, give us more money. And the response was, well, why should we give you more money to do the same thing? So we have to begin with that premise that we're going to have to get smarter at how we use the money that we have. Now, getting smarter and using the money that we have requires that we rethink how we use resources. And one of the biggest resources that any organization has is time and staff time. And let me give you an example. I have a good friend in Taiwan, Kim Lee, who runs a big organization. And he's got a degree in marketing, and he loves efficiency and time management. So what he did 4 or 5 years ago was he simply said, we are going to change the way we do team meetings. We are going to focus, we're going to change how we use our time in the organization. And in that regard, the biggest time consumer is meetings. That people have meetings to plan meetings, and they have meetings that have no outcomes, and they have meetings that have no agenda. And so what he said then is he developed this policy essentially that said no meeting will exceed 60 minutes. Every meeting will have an agenda that's shared before the meeting. Every meeting will have a person that is organizes it and is responsible for it, running it. No meeting will have computers or phones available. Finally, every meeting will have a resolution, and that resolution will be shared immediately. In the process of doing that, he increased his available staff time to provide supports for people by 64%. He essentially doubled the time. So same staff, same pay. Now, I know you have unions, and that's always an issue. Much more effective and efficient a team meeting could be. If you reduce the length of a support plan from 44 pages to 3 pages, it's really a support plan. Think about how more efficient that organization could be. And the issue of efficiency and effectiveness are what policymakers are all concerned about. They want you to use the money that you are given, but to use it so that it produces a good effect, or at least an observable effect, that it just eats it up. Policymakers hate organizations that have no accountability. And that's the reason why I stressed earlier the importance of having some kind of a systematic approach to evaluate outcomes or impacts, if you prefer that word, impacts or outcomes, to show that really are producing a benefit to the person. Now, achieving goals is one of those benefits, but also becoming more independent is a benefit. Becoming more productive is a benefit. Becoming more a part of the community is a benefit. So it's that movement towards accountability that I think will help with convincing policymakers to work with you rather than the money givers and the money controllers. Now, the key thing is, from my perspective, is not how many are unemployed, but how many are employed. And can we increase that rate? And it's going to be a slow process. It's going to be absolutely, but at least we're focusing on increasing employment opportunities for people, and then expanding what those opportunities are. You know, there's a world of literature on supported employment, different models that you can use for supported employment. So that it's not just always being in a competitive employment situation. It's just, again, having some kind of a comprehensive view of what is employment, and then always moving towards the percent increase as opposed to the percent decrease. But yeah, your trend, I think, is very consistent with other places.
Okay.
Except maybe the Scandinavians. I think the Scandinavians are still doing, and then Germans are still doing a very good job in supported employment.
And you had the opportunity to look at our survey about the possible changes in our system, and you already said some very valuable things. Is there something you want to stress, or something else you remember and your attention?
What I might do is in the international survey on the shared citizenship paradigm, our final question was, what factors in your estimation are preventing the paradigm's acceptance, implementation, evaluation, and or confirmation? And here's the list. And I think you will see that all respondent countries, including your own, have just a lot of barriers, a lot of hurdles. For example, and now I'll just go through these rather quickly. The different stages in organization and service delivery development and performance. You know, what it amounts to essentially is that organizations that are alive and functional develop over time. And if you don't develop over time, you go down. And so a lot of organizations just need a kick in the rear end or whatever, or a new philosophy or new guidance or new management. One thing that is that the success of an organization depends very definitely upon the vision of the leader. And in those organizations that are willing to take risks and to implement a different vision of what they should be doing, are the organizations that you really want to get behind. And I would bet those organizations are led by a visionary, a person who wants to make change, because the organization and the leader become one in a very real sense. And so you want to focus on that one. So anyway, different stages of organization development. Some want to take risks, some don't want to take risks. Some want to make change, some don't want to make change. Secondly, the paradigm's core components are more present in policy than practice. And I think you alluded to that in your survey, or at least in one of your memos to me, that you have policies, but they aren't necessarily what you find in practice. And it's really easy to talk about inclusion and equity and empowerment, all those wonderful words, but it's hard to do. It's hard to do. Think, for example, each participant, when was the first time you went out to dinner with a service recipient? We talk about inclusion, we talk about involvement, but when was the first time? And I raise that purposely because that happened to me. Categorical care and rehabilitation systems. Categorical care is a big issue. And my bet is it's really magnified in a system that is very much a medical model, because they're going to care by category. And that also interacts and affects that evaluation system that we talked about before. If you're evaluating determination issues, then you really end up with having categorical care rather than inclusive care. A big difference. Cultural traditions and use of best practices. Cultural traditions can either help you or hurt you. And one of the cultural traditions that we experienced with you in Argentina was a tremendous power of familia, of family. And that's the hook, I think, that I would use as much as possible, because that's powerful in terms of producing change, but it's also powerful in providing services and supports. Lack of cross-discipline interactions. One of the reasons why we published the article we did on education, to recognize that each discipline has its contribution, but that there should be some commonality across that. A lack of understanding of context is another one. And I'm glad you raised context. I'm glad you're working on context. Lack of understanding or deficit thinking is another one, where people think about only the deficit of the person as opposed to the strengths and possibilities of the person. And then support needs not being integrated into support planning. And I think that's a big one to think a bit about. I think generally speaking, up to now, supports provision has been more important than supports assessment. Here to talk about the benefits of using a systematic approach to supports assessment. Because once you have standardized support assessment material or data or information about a person, you not only identify their support needs, but then you open the door to a whole bunch of other really good options. Number one, you can think about classifying people on the basis of their support need or needs as opposed to their intellectual functioning. And then you can also use supports and support needs for funding purposes, which legislators and funders really like because it's objective. And then you can also, and I want to compliment you seriously on not just where you are, but where you're going. I think there's a tremendous commitment, but despite all the craziness that's going on in the world today, and there's a lot of it, you're committed to providing personalized services and supports for people. The challenge that you have is really no different than the challenge that I think almost all, if not all, countries have. How do you make it work? And there's no simple answer, and no one from north of you a few miles can come in and say, hey, you need to do this. I would never say that. But I think there's some things that may help you. And hopefully our conversation today has facilitated that process. I think we need to remember that the change comes hard. Our own change as well, it's not just other people. But we just have to know where we're going. Yogi Berra, one of my favorite philosophers, who was a baseball guy, he said, the trouble is not knowing where you're going. is you may end up in the wrong place. And that's really fairly profound. The trouble with not knowing where you're going is you may end up in the wrong place. Well, I think you know where you're going. I don't have any doubt in my mind you know where you're going. Now it's just a matter of building that coalition. And I would really focus on coalitions. Building that coalition that knows clearly what are the parameters of the paradigm that you want to implement in Argentina. And you may have to contextualize it, make it your own, but I think the core components are there. And then work with all the constituents, and that's no easy job to bring it about. But you know where you're going, and I wish you well on that journey.
Well,
one final comment. Chinese, you never thought I'd get there, right? I promise you. But my last comment. No, I have two final comments. One is the journey is a reward. And that's a Chinese statement that I really think is important, because we must enjoy what we're doing along the way, realizing that we may not get all the way, but we're making progress towards that. And then my very final comment to each of you, my friends, is I never like to say goodbye. I only like to say until next time.
Yes.
Adios.